The Mafia boss was walking into his private gala when something sharp pierced the silence of the room. Not a gunshot, not a police siren, but the high-pitched sob of a child. Rico Voss froze, his dark, combed-back hair catching the light as he turned. A little girl stood there in a bright pink ruffled dress, her pigtails coming undone and her face flushed with tears. She wasn't holding a weapon or a bribe. She was holding a single trembling finger out, pointing it like a dagger at the heart of the room. "Please," she choked out through the tears. "That's the one!" she shouted, her voice echoing off the marble walls. Rico's lead bodyguard, Ivan, moved instantly, his black leather jacket rustling and his jaw tensing behind his dark sunglasses as he pulled the girl into a protective hold. The elite guests whispered in shock, but Rico raised his hand, silencing the room. No one interrupted his summits. People came to him for power, not for protection. Rico stepped forward, his tattoos on his neck visible as his eyebrows rose in sheer confusion. "What are you talking about, kid?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Nora swallowed hard, her watery eyes never leaving the guest of honor sitting at Rico's own table. "That's the man who hits my mama," she said, her small arm extended firmly with a certainty that chilled the air. That made Rico pause. He looked at the prestigious philanthropist beside him, then back at Nora's flushed face and the way she clung to Ivan's arm for dear life. Rico realized in that moment that his clean business partner had been using Rico's own reputation as a shield for his cruelty. The Mafia boss didn't step in because it was profitable. He stepped in because the truth this little girl just shouted was worth more than any merger. Stay with me until the end, because what Rico discovered when he finally burst into that man's home shocked even a man who thought he had seen every kind of evil. The Grand Astoria was a place of gold lights and soft music. It smelled like expensive perfume and old money. Men in fancy suits shook hands and laughed, while women in long dresses moved like bright clouds across the floor. They all looked perfect. They all looked safe. Then the heavy doors swung open, and the room seemed to go cold. Rico Voss walked in like he owned the air everyone was breathing. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He wore a black leather jacket that looked tough and worn, and dark sunglasses that hid his eyes from the world. Behind him stepped Ivan, a man built like a stone wall, with tattoos creeping up his neck. They didn't fit in this beautiful room. They looked like wolves that had just walked into a field of sheep. As they moved through the crowd, people stopped talking. A path opened up in front of Rico without him having to say a single word. He didn't smile at the mayors or the rich bankers. He just walked, his boots clicking hard against the marble floor. He was here for business, and in his world, business was the only thing that mattered. Ivan stayed 2 steps behind, his eyes moving constantly. He watched every hand, every door, and every shadow. He was Rico's shadow, and he was just as dangerous. To the people at the gala, this was a night of fun and charity. To Rico and Ivan, it was just another territory to control. They reached the center of the room, standing under a giant glass light that made the leather of Rico's jacket shine. Rico adjusted his sleeves, his face like a mask of iron. He was ready to meet the men who ran the city, men who thought they were powerful because they had big bank accounts. But Rico knew the truth. Power wasn't about money. It was about who people feared when the lights went out. He reached for a glass of water from a passing tray, his movements slow and steady. Everything was going exactly as planned. The elite were waiting to shake his hand, and the deals were ready to be signed. He was the most dangerous man in the room, and he knew it. But as he turned to face the main table, he felt a small, sudden tug on the bottom of his jacket. It was a tiny pull, so light he almost missed it. He looked down, expecting to see a dropped napkin or a stray dog. Instead, he saw a flash of bright pink. Rico froze. He looked down and saw a little girl. She was wearing a bright pink dress with ruffles on the sleeves, but it was covered in gray dust. Her hair was pulled back in two messy pigtails, and loose strands hung over her face. She wasn't more than 4 years old. Her small hands were gripped tight around the leather of his jacket, and she was shaking so hard that he could feel it through his sleeve. She didn't belong here. This was a place for people with polished shoes and cold hearts, not for a child with watery eyes and dirty sneakers. Ivan stepped forward quickly, his face full of surprise. He reached out to move her away, but Rico held up a hand. The big bodyguard stopped instantly. The little girl didn't run away from Rico, even though everyone else in the city did. She looked up at him, her face red and wet from crying. To everyone else, Rico Voss was a monster, a man to be feared. But to this girl, he just looked like something solid. He looked like a mountain that wouldn't move, and in her world, everything else was falling apart. "Help," she whispered. The word was so small it almost got lost in the sound of the violins playing across the room. She buried her face against his leg, sobbing into the black leather. Rico stood perfectly still. He was used to people begging for their lives or their money, but he had never had a child cling to him for safety. It was a strange, heavy feeling in his chest.
Around them, the rich guests began to whisper. They pointed and stared, their faces full of judgment. They didn't see a scared child. They saw an embarrassing mess in the middle of their fancy party. Rico didn't care about their whispers. He looked down at the top of the girl's head, watching the way her small shoulders jumped with every sob. Gently, almost like he was afraid he might break her, Rico put a hand on her shoulder. His hand was huge compared to her, covered in scars from years of fighting. But he didn't push her away. He looked at Ivan, and for the first time in 15 years, the bodyguard saw a flicker of something human behind Rico's dark glasses. The girl pulled back just a little, her tiny finger still hooked into his jacket. She wiped her nose with her sleeve and looked toward the center of the room. Her fear was turning into something else, something like desperate courage. She wasn't just hiding, she was looking for someone. "I found him," she said, her voice shaking but clear. She let go of Rico's jacket and raised her right arm. Her small finger pointed straight past the waiters and the flowers, landing on a man sitting at the head of the most expensive table in the room. Rico's jaw tightened as he followed her gaze. He knew that man. Everyone knew that man. He was the guest of honor, the man who was supposed to be Rico's newest partner. But as the girl pointed, her face twisted with a fresh wave of pain. "That's him!" she cried out, and the whole room went silent. "That's the one who hits my mama!" The silence that followed Nora's words was heavier than any silence Rico had ever heard. It wasn't the quiet of a peaceful night. It was the kind of silence that happens right before a bomb goes off. Hundreds of people in the room stopped breathing at the same time. The clinking of forks and the soft sound of the violins died away, leaving only the sound of Nora's small, shaky breaths. Rico didn't move. He kept his hand on the little girl's shoulder, his dark glasses pointed straight at the head table. Sitting there was Julian Vane. Julian was wearing a white tuxedo that cost more than most people made in a year. He was a man known for giving millions of dollars to hospitals and schools. He had a perfect smile and a calm face that made everyone trust him. For a second, Julian's face stayed perfect. Then his eyes flickered. It was a tiny movement, a flash of something dark and sharp, before he forced a confused laugh. He looked around at the other guests, spreading his hands wide, as if the whole thing were a funny mistake. "I'm sorry," Julian said, his voice smooth like silk. "Does someone know whose child this is? She seems very confused." But Nora didn't back down. She stepped closer to Rico's leg, her finger still pointing like a dagger. "You hurt her," she shouted, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. "You pulled her hair and made her cry. You said if I told, you would put us in the ground."
Rico felt a cold anger start to burn in his stomach. He looked at Julian, then back at the girl. He noticed the way Julian's face was turning a pale, sickly color under the bright lights. The rich people in the room began to mutter. They looked at the girl in the messy pink dress, and then they looked at the hero in the white suit. Ivan shifted his weight behind Rico. The bodyguard's jaw was set tight, and his eyes were locked on Julian's security team. He was waiting for the word to move. Rico knew what this meant. Julian Vane was his biggest business partner. If Rico stood up for this girl, he would be throwing away millions of dollars. He would be starting a war with the city's elite. Rico looked down at Nora. She was looking up at him with so much hope it hurt to see. She didn't know about business deals or money. She only knew that her mother was in pain and that this scary man in the leather jacket was the only person who hadn't walked away. Slowly, Rico stood up straight. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the cameras. He fixed his gaze on Julian Vane. The guest of honor tried to keep smiling, but his hands were shaking as he reached for his wine glass. The mask of the good man was starting to crack, and Rico was going to be the one to break it. "Ivan," Rico said, his voice low and dangerous. "Yes, boss." "Clear the room," Rico ordered. "Mr. Vane and I need to have a private talk about his manners." The room became a storm of moving people. Following Rico's order, the guests scrambled toward the exits, their fancy shoes clicking quickly on the floor. They didn't want to be near the explosion they knew was coming. Within minutes, the giant ballroom felt empty and cold. Only the heavy sound of the air conditioner and the sobbing of the little girl remained. Ivan stepped closer to Rico. He kept his eyes on Julian Vane's guards, who were standing like frozen statues across the room. Ivan leaned his head toward Rico's ear. His voice was a very low whisper, so quiet that only Rico could hear it. "Boss, we need to think about this," Ivan said. His voice was steady, but there was a warning in it. "Julian Vane isn't just some guy. He's the bridge to the city council. He's the reason our docks stay open without the police bothering us. If you lay a hand on him, we lose everything we built this year." Rico didn't answer. He stayed perfectly still, his hand still resting on Nora's small shoulder. He could feel her trembling. Every time she looked at Julian, she flinched, as if she expected to be hit.
"He's worth millions to us, boss," Ivan continued, his voice urgent. "Walking away is the smart move. Let the girl go. We can send some money to the mother later and call it even. Don't throw away the empire for a child we don't even know. Walk away." Rico looked at Julian. The philanthropist was trying to look brave now that the cameras were gone. He straightened his white tie and took a slow sip of his wine. He looked at Rico with a smug expression, as if he knew he was too expensive to hurt. Julian believed that money was a shield that could protect him from anything, even the truth coming out of a child's mouth. Ivan was right about the money. Business was usually the only thing Rico cared about. He had spent 15 years making sure his bank accounts were full and his territory was safe. He had ignored a lot of bad things to stay on top. Usually, he would have listened to Ivan. He would have walked out the door and forgotten the girl's name by breakfast. But then, Nora looked up at him. Her eyes were red and a single tear rolled upon her cheek. She wasn't looking at his expensive watch or his famous leather jacket. She was looking for a hero. She had walked into a room full of monsters and pointed her finger at the biggest one of all, trusting that Rico was different. Rico felt the weight of the $5 bill Sophie had given him in the other story, a memory of honor that lived in the back of his mind. He realized that if he walked away now, he wasn't a king. He was just another coward in a suit, no better than Julian.
Rico didn't look at Ivan. He didn't acknowledge the millions of dollars he was about to lose. He simply stepped forward, pulling Nora gently behind him so she was shielded by his body. He took off his dark sunglasses, letting Julian see the cold, hard fire in his eyes for the first time. "Ivan?" Rico said, his voice like cracking ice. "Yeah, boss?" Ivan sighed, already knowing the answer. "Lock the doors. Nobody leaves until I hear the truth." The heavy doors clicked shut, and the sound echoed like a gunshot in the empty ballroom. Julian Vane stood by the table, trying to look bored, but the sweat on his forehead told a different story. Rico didn't look at him yet. Instead, his eyes moved to a small door near the back of the room, the one used by the kitchen staff. A woman was standing there, frozen in the shadows. She was pale, and her hair was falling out of a messy bun. She wore a simple dress that looked out of place among the gold and silk of the gala. As soon as Rico saw her, he knew she was Nora's mother. The resemblance was in the shape of her eyes and the way she held her breath.
But it was what was in her eyes that made Rico's blood turn to ice. It wasn't just sadness. It was a deep, soul-crushing terror. She was looking at Julian, and she was shaking so hard she had to lean against the wall to stay standing. Rico noticed a dark, purplish bruise peeking out from under the sleeve of her dress, and a small cut on her lip that was fresh. Julian followed Rico's gaze and let out a sharp, mean laugh. "She's just a maid, Rico," Julian said, his voice turning cold. "She's clumsy. She falls down the stairs. You know how these people are. They aren't worth our time." Nora let out a small cry and tried to run toward her mother, but the woman shook her head quickly, her eyes wide with fear. She was too scared to even move toward her own child while Julian was watching. She looked at Rico, and for a split second, their eyes met. In that moment, Rico didn't see a business partner in a white tuxedo across the room. He saw a monster who used his money and his name to break people who couldn't fight back. Rico realized that Julian hadn't just been hitting her. He had been telling her that Rico Voss was his friend. He had convinced this poor woman that the most dangerous man in the city would help him keep her quiet. Rico felt a flash of pure rage. He had spent his life being feared, but he had never allowed himself to be a shield for a bully. "Look at her eyes, Julian," Rico said, his voice a low growl that sounded like a predator closing in. "Rico, don't be dramatic," Julian snapped, though he stepped back as Rico moved closer. "Think about the docks. Think about the millions. You're going to let a servant come between us?" Rico didn't answer with words. He walked toward Nora's mother, his heavy boots sounding like thunder on the floor. As he got close, she flinched, pulling her arms tight against her chest. Rico stopped a few feet away and took a deep breath. He saw the way she looked at Nora, then back at him, waiting for the blow she thought was coming because she was Julian's property. Rico turned his head slightly to look at Julian over his shoulder. The philanthropist was no longer smiling. The mask was completely gone, replaced by the ugly face of a man who thought he was untouchable. Rico realized that Ivan's warning about the millions didn't matter anymore. Some things were worth more than money, and the look in that mother's eyes was a debt Rico was going to collect right now. Rico turned away from the mother and walked back toward the center of the room. His face was calm, but his heart felt like a storm. He reached onto a nearby table and picked up 2 crystal glasses. He filled them with sparkling water, the bubbles rising quickly to the top. He didn't look like a man about to start a war. He looked like a man ready to celebrate a deal. "You are right, Julian," Rico said. His voice was smooth now, almost friendly. "We shouldn't let a small mistake ruin a big night. Let's have a private toast to our future, just the 2 of us."
Julian let out a long breath, and his shoulders relaxed. He thought he had won. He thought Rico had chosen the money over the girl. "That's more like it, Rico," Julian said with a wide, fake smile. "I knew you were a smart man. Business is business, after all." Rico gestured toward a set of heavy wooden doors at the side of the ballroom. These doors led to a private office,
a place far away from the bright lights and the empty tables. It was a room where the walls were thick and the windows were covered by heavy curtains. It was a place where shadows lived. "After you," Rico said, holding one glass out. Julian took the glass and started walking. He held his head high, feeling powerful again. He didn't notice that Ivan was staying behind with Nora and her mother. He didn't notice the way Rico's hand stayed balled into a tight fist at his side. Julian walked into the dark office, and Rico followed, closing the door softly behind them. The office was quiet. The only light came from a single lamp on a large desk. The gold and silk of the gala felt 1,000 miles away. Julian sat down in a leather chair and took a sip of his drink. He looked at Rico and grinned. "We can fix this, Rico. I'll give that woman some money to disappear. The kid, too. By tomorrow, nobody will even remember that little scene in the ballroom." Rico stood in the shadows, his leather jacket looking like dark armor. He didn't sit down. He didn't drink. He just watched Julian talk. He listened to the man plan how to buy his way out of being a monster. Julian talked about contracts and profit as if those things could wash the bruises off a woman's arm. "Is that how you think this works?" Rico asked. His voice was so low it was almost a whisper. Julian stopped smiling. "What do you mean? We have a deal, Rico. My money is already moving into your accounts. We are partners." Rico stepped into the small circle of light. He set his glass down on the desk without taking a sip. The air in the room felt heavy and tight. Julian looked up, and for the first time he saw that the deal was already dead. He saw that Rico hadn't brought him into the shadows to talk about money. He had brought him here because the shadows were the only place where Julian Vane would finally have to answer for what he had done. Julian tried to stand up, but Rico placed a heavy hand on his shoulder, forcing him back into the chair. The businessman's face was pale now, his expensive white tuxedo looking like a coward's uniform in the dim light. "Rico, let's be reasonable," Julian stammered, his voice losing its smooth edge. "This is just a domestic matter. It has nothing to do with our business." Rico leaned down until his face was inches from Julian's. The light from the desk lamp highlighted the hard lines of his jaw. "You think you know me because you see the black cars and the money," Rico said, his voice as sharp as a razor. "You think because I break the law, I don't have any, but you're wrong." Rico stepped back, pacing slowly in the shadows like a panther. "I deal in a lot of dark things, Julian. I deal in drugs, blood, and territory. I've done things that would keep most men awake at night. That is the world I chose. But in my world, there is a line that keeps us from becoming the very animals we hunt." Julian opened his mouth to speak, but Rico silenced him with a cold look. "My one rule is simple," Rico continued. "I don't deal with men who touch women. I don't partner with bullies who hide behind a child's fear. You used my name to keep that woman quiet. You told her I would help you hurt her. You made my reputation a shield for your sickness." The silence in the office was suffocating. Julian looked toward the door, but he knew Ivan was on the other side. There was no escape. He realized that all his millions couldn't buy him mercy from a man who valued his code more than his profit. Rico wasn't looking at him like a business partner anymore. He was looking at him like a piece of trash that needed to be thrown away. "You thought I was like you," Rico whispered, his eyes narrowing. "You thought that because I have blood on my hands, I wouldn't care about a mother and her child. But that's the difference between us, Julian. I know exactly what I am. You pretend to be a saint while you act like a monster in the dark." Rico reached out and grabbed Julian's silk tie, pulling him upward until they were eye to eye. "The deal is dead. Your reputation is about to follow it. And before the night is over, you're going to understand that the Voss family doesn't protect people like you. We erase them." Julian's glass fell from his hand, shattering on the floor. The sound was final, marking the end of his powerful life. Rico didn't flinch. He had spent his life making difficult choices, but this was the easiest one he had ever made. He wasn't just protecting a woman and a child. He was protecting the only part of his soul that was still clean. Rico stepped out of the dark office, closing the door on Julian's ruined life. He didn't look back. His mind was already moving to the next task. In the ballroom, Ivan was standing by Nora and her mother. The woman looked up as Rico approached, her eyes searching his face for a sign of what would happen next. She looked like she was waiting for another cage to close around her. "It's over," Rico said, his voice unusually soft. "He won't be bothering you again. Not tonight, not ever." He looked at Ivan and gave a short, sharp nod. Ivan understood. He pulled out a specialized phone and made a single call. Rico's organization was famous for making things disappear, but usually they made problems go away. Tonight, they were going to make a family vanish into safety. "We have a car waiting at the service entrance," Rico told the mother. "It will take you to the airport. There's a private plane waiting. By sunrise, you will be in a place where Julian Vane's name has no power. You will have a new home, new names, and enough money to never have to work for a man like him again." The woman shook her head, tears finally spilling over. "Why?" she whispered. "We have nothing to give you. We can't pay for this." Rico looked down at Nora. The little girl had stopped crying. She was staring at him with wide, curious eyes, still holding on to a piece of his leather jacket. "The payment was made when she walked up to me," Rico said. "She was brave enough to tell the truth. That's worth more than any money Julian had." Ivan led them through the back hallways, avoiding the main streets and the cameras. They reached a black SUV with tinted windows that was idling in the alley. The driver was one of Rico's most trusted men, a man who knew how to keep a secret forever. As they reached the door, Nora stopped. She turned back and reached out her small hand. Rico hesitated, then reached down. Her tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb in a quick, tight squeeze. "Thank you, Mr. Giant," she said quietly. Rico watched as they climbed into the car. He watched the taillights disappear around the corner, leaving the alley in darkness. He knew that by tomorrow, Julian's lawyers and friends would be looking for them, but they would find nothing. Rico had erased their trail completely. He stood in the cold night air for a long time, the silence of the city wrapping around him. For 15 years, he had used his power to build an empire of fear. But as he turned to walk back towards his own car, he felt a strange lightness in his chest. He had lost millions of dollars and a powerful ally, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like a monster. He felt like a man who had finally used his strength for the right reason. 3 months had passed since the night the gold lights of the Grand Astoria went dark. For the rest of the city, life moved on. Julian Vane was no longer the guest of honor at fancy parties. His business had fallen apart, and his name was only spoken in whispers behind closed doors. Rico Voss, however, was still the man who ruled the streets. He still wore his black leather jacket, and people still stepped aside when he walked by. One rainy afternoon, Rico was sitting in his private office at Bella Vista. He was looking over maps and numbers, the usual business that kept his territory running. There was a knock at the door, and Ivan walked in. The big bodyguard wasn't carrying a weapon or a warning this time. Instead, he held a small, plain white envelope. "This came in the mail today, boss," Ivan said. He looked a little confused. "It doesn't have a return address, just your name on the front." Rico took the envelope and opened it slowly. He expected a message from a rival or a note about a shipment. Instead, a piece of paper fell out onto his desk. It wasn't a formal letter. It was a drawing made with bright, waxy crayons. The drawing showed a very tall man in a black jacket and dark glasses. He was standing like a giant in front of a small, happy house with a yellow sun above it. Next to the man were 2 stick figures holding hands, a woman and a little girl in a bright pink dress. At the bottom of the page, in shaky but careful handwriting, were the words, "Our Guardian." Rico stared at the drawing for a long time. He remembered the way Nora's small hand had squeezed his thumb before she disappeared into the night. He remembered the terror in her mother's eyes that had turned into hope. He had spent his whole life building a reputation as a man to be feared. He wanted the world to tremble when they heard the name Rico Voss. But looking at the crayon drawing, he realized something had changed. To the rest of the city, he was still a wolf. But to one little girl and her mother, he was the reason they could sleep without locking their doors in fear. He wasn't just a boss anymore. He was a protector. Ivan cleared his throat, leaning over to see the paper. "Do you want me to throw that away, boss?" "No," Rico said, his voice quiet but firm. He stood up and walked over to the wall where he kept his maps of the city docks and downtown streets. He moved a map of his most profitable territory to the side and used a piece of tape to stick the drawing right in the center of the wall. Rico sat back down and put on his dark sunglasses. He knew the world was still a dangerous place, and he knew he was still a man of the shadows. But as he looked at the big man in glasses on his wall, he realized that for the first time in his life, his power finally had a purpose that was worth more than millions. He was a criminal, yes, but he had found the one thing money could never buy: the trust of a child.